Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, and we have Mark Shaw back with us. Sixth or seventh time, it seems, right? And for those of you who are...
Hard to believe.
For those of you who are unaware, Mark is a big YouTube hit. Has over 15 million views from lectures that he's done, and about 3.5 million of those are from Commonwealth Club events that he's had here. And we're here tonight to see the latest pieces of details that have been coming in as we really went into last time, maybe a year and a half ago or so. There's been a lot of information that's come in to Mark over the internet because of so many people watching these videos and then saying, hey, I have this connection, or my family has this connection, or something like that. And you know, some of those things don't work out, but some of them have proved very, very useful. So we're going to go to the slideshow.
Okay, the reason I bring this up is because it's been an evolution for me. How many of you remember Melvin Belli, the famous attorney? Well, I was never even going to look into any of this stuff about the assassinations or Dorothy Kilgallen or anything. But I practiced law with Mr. Belli over here on Montgomery Street in the 1980s. And he and I got to be pretty good friends. He took me to the Major League Baseball All-Star game in his Rolls Royce. As you know, he was quite a character, married 6 times and everything. But when he died in 1996, I decided to write a book about him because he had written 2 autobiographies and they conflicted. Okay? So it became Melvin Belli, King of the Courtroom. And I wrote that book and I was done. But then I learned more about Belli's affiliation with the Mafia and with him being involved with representing Jack Ruby. So I went back and wrote a book called The Poisoned Patriarch about how the Kennedys stole the 1960 election. I was done. While I was interviewing, though, people that Belli knew, he said, well, Mark, you know Belli knew Dorothy Kilgallen. I had lost track of her, I like an awful lot of other people when she died in 1965. I said, well, he was on What's My Line with her, and George is going to show you some clips from that show. He said, no, Mark, you don't know anything about her, syndicated to 200 newspapers across the country when people, a syndicated column, when people read the newspaper. What's My Line TV star, watched by 10 million every Sunday night. A radio show watched by, or listened to by 1 million people. And she's the most credible reporter to have ever covered the JFK assassination. And then the guy said to me, and you know, by the way, when Dorothy died, Belli said to me that it was intentional, that she didn't overdose on drugs, she was murdered. Well, that got my interest, and I started investigating and researching Dorothy. That became the bestseller, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much. And I went through Dorothy's entire life as far as what had happened to her, where she was from, and all of that. Then I wrote a book called Collateral Damage, connecting the deaths of Marilyn Monroe, JFK, and Dorothy Kilgallen. And I was able to do that through the research that I found, and most of my research comes from primary sources and all of that. So that book was one that meant a lot to me, because Dorothy really defended Marilyn when she died. Marilyn never committed suicide. It's ridiculous, and I'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. Anyway, that was it. But then I had a gentleman, George said that what happens is that people get in touch with me, and I hope that some of you, if you have any information or people watching this program, will get in touch with me. I get these tips from all over the world. A guy that I never knew named Morris Wolf contacts me one day and said he watched a presentation of mine at a library near Dallas. And Mark, when I looked through that about your book, Denial of Justice, I heard the name Dorothy Kilgallen. Well, I knew her. And of course, that got my dander up. What? And he started telling me about Dorothy Kilgallen and her friendship with a member of the Warren Commission and his being the legislative assistant and everything. And it led to Fighting for Justice, which showed the corruption at the Warren Commission from J. Edgar Hoover down, where they sold the American people in the world, Oswald alone. So that was it. All right? But as we will find out here, probably about a year ago, I found a video of a gentleman who knew someone right before Robert Kennedy died. I also found what I believe, and will show you, the most important document about the JFK assassination in history, and that has become abuse of power. Now, I want to mention one more thing, and it's a plaudit to dear George here. After he read the manuscript, we got together and talked, and George went ahead and gave me a small piece of paper. And on that small piece of paper, he wrote the following. I think it was during a lunch. Here it is. I kept it all these months. Mark Shaw update, the abuse of power, how Carlos Marcello used patsies to murder JFK, Dorothy Kilgallen, and Robert Kennedy. That's the name of this presentation tonight. So hats off to George, huh? Because he knew after he was smart, he's such a smart guy anyway, but he knew after, my talking about things and all of that and reading the manuscript that was where we wanted to go with this.
This is a slide that shows Dorothy Kilgallen surrounded by people when she's a celebrity journalist. I mean, she's covering either the Sam Shepard,
Dr. Sam Shepard's case.
Sam Shepard's case, the one that turned into The Fugitive, right? Right.
Yes, and this is on the DorothyKilgallenStory.org. This is all the other journalists admiring Dorothy. Look at them, how they look at her, the respect they had for her. I've heard from people around the world, I wish we had a journalist like Dorothy Kilgallen today. Mm-hmm. This is Dorothy, just such admiration. You can see it. Go ahead, please.
One other thing that I'd like to say is she was very adventurous as a young woman, and she went off at 22 or something on this round the world thing. Why don't you show me? He's got one of the original copies here.
Yeah. Where did Dorothy get all of her courage to go forward with covering these trials, going up against the authorities and all of that, and then in the JFK assassination, just slamming the door on J. Edgar Hoover and a mafioso and all these people? Well, in 1936, at age 23 years old, she went ahead and entered what they called the Girl Around the World. I'm sorry, the Race Around the World. You'll read about it in the book. Mm-hmm. And basically, two older men who were with the New York Times, the New York Herald, were going to, it may not sound like a lot, but at that time, they were going to race around the world using only commercial transportation that the public could use. Leave from New York City, all the way around the world, all right? Well, Dorothy found out about that.
A race. They wanted to race this.
Yeah, the race.
Whoever came back first.
And so Dorothy got her newspaper to back her, and she took off and went up against these guys. In fact, she says in here, I don't know if I'll beat them, but I'm going to do the damnedest I can. She was a very, Larry King one time called Dorothy Kilgallen a gutsy broad. Mm. Well, in a lot of ways she was, and she had to do that. So one of the reasons I brought that today is because I was able to find a rare copy of this. I got the copyright permission, and I'm going to go ahead and publish this book at some point next year using her words, because if I could write as well as Dorothy Kilgallen, I'd have had 25 bestsellers, but I can't. And I just want to give you a quick excerpt of this because she ends up in danger in Indochina. The pilot shrugged his shoulders in original despair and nosed down for a landing in our little plane while thoughts of bandits, kidnapping, murder, and revolution sizzled in my head. Bump, bum, splash. We thumbed down jarringly in the middle of a rice field. The plane was not damaged, but in a second I thought all my worst fears about this crazy thing I was doing made sense. Appearing like gnomes from the ground, around 600 chattering natives, nearly naked, surrounded the plane. They spoke no English, of course, and pointed their spears at me. Now, she survives that, but just think about what she did there. She helped the reader what? Feel like they were right there with her. And that's what Dorothy did with every single thing she ever wrote.
Yeah. And this is just to show, Marcus, put this up before, but she was writing in columns in her usual columns about the Oswald case, about the JFK case, saying, this going on. She didn't say the quote there. Why don't you read the quote from her?
Well, the Oswald file must not close. I looked it up the other day in my files because I found 26 different columns that Dorothy Kilgallen had written about the JFK assassination. Now, if we can pause here for just a minute. We'll get to this, but when JFK died, she just was so disturbed because she knew him. She was a very close friend of his. He used to come to parties at hers on East 68th Street and play charades with her. I have at one point he invited Dorothy and her young son Kerry to the White House and made a big fuss over Kerry. And when JFK died, she wrote in a column, what I remember is a tall man stooping over a little boy, praising him for his letters. I have an account by a producer who was with Dorothy at home when JFK called her one night asking her an opinion about that. She was trusted by everyone back there. And that particular column was the first one. When she went to Dallas, by the way, the first thing she did was interview the police chief. And I was able to find a rare book by that police chief. Jesse Curry reveals his personal assassination file. I will tell you, an awful lot of my research has been out there forever, but an awful lot of the authors and everybody, they just disregard it or don't do their own homework. Because this is the Bible for what happened in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. And Dorothy, the first thing she did is interview Jesse Curry, and what did he tell her? The shots came from the overpass and the grassy knoll. Not, okay? So she was really in tune with all of this and on the job in terms of looking into finding out exactly what happened to JFK.
All right. So now,
this other quote is really strong.
Yeah.
Sorry. They've killed the now. Just think if you are J. Edgar Hoover, who's propelling the Oswald alone situation. This Carlos Marcello, a mobster we're going to talk about, who had the strongest motive to eliminate JFK so Bobby Kennedy would be powerless. This is what she writes. You talk about guts. You talk about her just throwing this in their face. She went ahead and told author Mark Lane, a friend of hers, they've killed the president. The government is not prepared to tell us the truth, and I'm going to do everything in my power to find out what really happened. Talk about putting a target on your back, right?
Yeah.
That was Dorothy.
So now we're going to show you a video from What's My Line, the show that she was on. And it's the show she did on Sunday, and she was found dead on Monday, the day after that. And she supposedly committed suicide because
Or overdosed on drugs.
Or overdosed on drugs, right. Okay. So I want you, and Mark in particular, wants you to see Dorothy and how she handled herself in this show the night before she supposedly gave up her life.
Exactly.
All right, so we can play the first video.
Now, from New York, let's meet our What's My Line panel. First, the popular columnist whose voice of Broadway appears in papers coast to coast, Miss Dorothy Kilgallen.
Yay!
Thank you. On my left, a young man who's just returned from Africa for making a picture called Marrakesh, Mr. Tony Randall.
All right. Panel, I will admit we're being tricky, and we have perhaps 3.5 minutes to see what you can do. We'll tell you that Miss Kane is self-employed and deals in a service, and we'll begin with Dorothy Kilgallen.
Could I use your service, Miss Kane?
I think so.
Could Mr. Randall?
Yes?
You're quite sure about him, aren't you?
Reasonably.
Well,
You may be, Miss Kane.
If we had need of your service, would we go to you rather than ringing you up and summoning you?
You would have to take the initiative to utilize the service, yes.
All right. If we took the initiative, would she come to us?
no.
Specifically and in person, no. That's 1 down and 9 to go, Mr. Red. 4 down and 6 to go, Miss Kilgallen.
Is there anything entertaining about your work?
I would say yes.
You would. And I would agree with you. Are you in the communications field?
Yes.
Are you in radio?
No.
5 down and 5 to go, Mr. Randall.
Are you an entertainer?
Not in the
No.
sense as it's used. 6 down and 4 to go, Miss Francis.
And you are not in television?
No.
And you are not in the theater?
No.
But you are in communications. Do you have anything to do with is the telephone part of your job?
No.
No. 7 down and 3 to go, Mr. Sir.
Transportation or tourism, any part of your
No.
job?
8 down and 2 to go. Well, I'm going to turn the cards over because you're jumping on. What is it, Dorothy?
Is she a writer?
Yes. Right. Good. But more specifically, Dorothy, sharing journalism with you, Miss Kane is a football writer. She writes 2 football columns, one directed at women to explain football to them, and then she writes for the Football News, which is a newspaper
You should
for
explain
the
football to the
fraternity.
2 New York professional teams.
What was the matter with the Giants?
Nice to have had you with us,
Thank
sir.
you.
And good night, Dorothy Kilgallen.
Good night, John. Good night, Tony. Please come again.
Now, Eleanor Penna is her name. She watched one of my presentations here. I get a goosebump with this. She watched a presentation here and got in touch with me, and I interviewed her. She's 93 now, and she gave me the account of being with Dorothy on the last night that Dorothy died. How sharp she was, no slurring of words. She guessed 2 of the occupations when nobody else could. I mean, this is not a woman who was having any problems with drugs or alcohol or whatever on the last night of her life.
Yeah. So we wanted to show you that. So of course, what happened next was she had. You go ahead.
Dorothy began to investigate the JFK assassination, as I mentioned, all right? She went to Dallas. She posted these columns. She then was the only reporter out of 400 at the Jack Ruby trial. Just think of that, from people around the world to interview Jack Ruby 3 times. And what did she do after she talked to him and wrote a column and everything? He sent her to New Orleans. He kind of confessed to her exactly what his participation was in the JFK assassination, which, as you recall, was killing Lee Harvey Oswald. So she went to New Orleans, and she took a hairdresser with her named Mark Sinclair. They flew there, and she then started investigating this Carlos Marcello that we'll talk about, this New Orleans Don. And she went to his brother's bar. And whatever she learned, she called the hairdresser from her hotel and said to him, "You go back to New York City and you don't tell anybody that you were here." And so he did. And when she got back to New York City, she made the same mistake that Marilyn Monroe made just before she died, becoming a blabbermouth. Because Marilyn, I've proven, was going to tell everything that the Kennedys told her about a lot of these secrets that they had while they were in office, and they couldn't let her do that, and so they orchestrated her death. Same thing with Dorothy. She started talking to everybody. I'm going to crack the case wide open. I know exactly what happened, on and on and on. And then she scared the bejesus out of them because she said, if the wrong people knew what I know about the assassination, it would cost me my life. I bought a gun. I'm afraid for my life and family. That same Kerry that she took to the White House, she was scared to death the day that his photograph appeared on the cover of the New York Times, where he was running around Central Park. And she knew what? Right away. They were following her son. And they all said, "Dorothy, stop, quit. Don't write your book for Random House, your tell-all book for Random House." And it was less than a month later that she was dead. This Ron Pataki, George is so smart in saying that there runs a pattern through the 3 deaths of JFK, Dorothy, and Robert Kennedy, as we will do. But obviously we have the Oswald, Patsy with JFK. This man, Ron Pataki, was a good friend and a romantic interest of Dorothy. Her marriage was estranged and everything. And she made the biggest mistake in sharing some of her JFK assassination information with him. Like, as we'll talk about with Sirhan Sirhan, He had gambling debts. He was an alcoholic. He was all of this, easily manipulated as a patsy. And this is the guy, I interviewed him 2 or 3 times. I thought that finally he was going to admit that he set up Dorothy for the kill, and then he just hung up the phone and died before I could put him in prison. So there we are, Dorothy Kilgallen found dead.
Right.
So here's the situation. Now you tell me whether or not this sounds suspicious to you. She was found in a bedroom in her townhouse, in a bedroom she never slept in, wearing her eyelashes, makeup, and hairpiece, with a book that she had already read upside down on her lap. The air conditioner was on, even though it was freezing outside. So the hairdresser finds her body on the morning of November 8th, 1965, all right? And they don't call the police for several hours, but even before they don't, somebody comes to the door, and I interviewed the butler's daughter, and they race into her townhouse and steal all of her JFK files, her manuscript for the book, and all of that. And then a first-year detective is assigned to the case of one of the most famous women in the world, and what does he do? He just decides there's an empty bottle of Seconal on one of the tables by the bed, and this is just another celebrity who overdosed. I've proven in the book this time that the cover-up regarding Dorothy's death escalates from how I show that Marcello was connected to Ron Pataki, but also there's some evidence that you will read in the book by 4 people that I just interviewed again who worked at the medical examiner's office. And one of them is named Stephen Goldner, who said to me in the interview, Mark, it wasn't like Joe Bonanno, the mobster, ran the medical examiner's office, but all of the people who worked there were Sicilian. And I've connected them into Marcello. But this is what happened, and this is what's tragic, is that the medical examiners went ahead and told the public she died of an overdose of drugs, circumstances undetermined. What the hell was that supposed to mean? So everybody took it as the fact that she either committed suicide or overdosed on drugs. And you know what happened? Dorothy's name was erased from the face of the earth. When I started researching, there was nothing out there. I had to go to the National Archives. My wife, Lou, who's helped me so much with everything I've done. We went to New York City, to the New York City Library. We went to Lincoln Center. There's a huge deposit of Dorothy Kilgallen material there. I had to just start from scratch because whoever killed her got exactly what they wanted, and I believe that was Marcello and his people, and she vanished from the face of the earth. Now, I'm happy that through my books and so on and so forth, she's come back to life in some ways. And one thing about this that's most interesting is that not too long ago, George and I are going to talk about a celebration for Dorothy, but also on YouTube now, there are some 80 episodes of What's My Line? So people can watch that. And the people that watch my videos on YouTube, they become reacquainted with Dorothy, and that's very special because she deserved it. Okay, Dorothy Kilgallen dead. Where are we, George?
We're at Ron's poem.
All right. So as a criminal defense lawyer, I always looked at motive, all right? That's where you start. And I defended people almost high-profile murder cases. When I covered after I quit practicing law, I ended up covering the O.J. Simpson case, the Kobe Bryant case, and the Mike Tyson trial, which became the basis for my very first book in 1992. And it all has to do with motive. That's what you look at. So what I was trying to find out to begin with, who had the greatest motive to have killed Dorothy Kilgallen? Well, it was Marcello, but he had to have used a patsy, because that's what the mafia does, right? They don't do their own dirty work. They find somebody else to do it. So all at once, I found about this Ron Pataki, and I went to his website. I'll just let you read along with me this particular poem that he wrote. While I'm spilling my guts, she is driving me nuts. Please fetch 2 drinks on the run. Just skip all the poison, the noise, make one of them poison, and don't tell me which one. Dorothy Kilgallen died of barbiturates being in her vodka and tonic drink the night that Ron Pataki walked her home. Now that is somebody what? You know this. This is somebody revealing facts about the murder that only the killer could know. So Dorothy Kilgallen was killed at the age of 52, far too early than she should have been for sure. Okay, here's the biggest surprise of my life. About a month ago, Dorothy's never gotten the respect. I've tried everything George knows to get her a new investigation of her death. I've gone to the last 2 DAs in New York City. I went back to New York and met with the chief of police. All of them told me, yeah, we'll look into her death. And they didn't. So Dorothy never got the investigation, and until the day I die, I'm going to try to get that investigation, because I'm all about justice, and she was denied justice, just as JFK was, and just as we will find out Sirhan was. So about a month ago, that councilman right there in the top, Robert Holden, got in touch with me, and one day, and I couldn't believe it. He said, Mark, at one point I promised you that I'm going to get a street codename for Dorothy. So on November 8th, 1965, 60th anniversary of her death, I flew back to New York with my wife, Lou, and we went to this celebration at East 68th Street and Park Avenue. And I spoke, and some other people spoke, and Bob Holden spoke, and everything. And it's just amazing what they said about Dorothy while we were there, because, it was just so special how much they talked about her and who she was and everything. And what was amazing to me was that there was a flyer they put out. And what they said about Dorothy was this: join us as we honor the extraordinary legacy of Dorothy Kilgallen, pioneering journalist, author, and fearless voice for the truth. Dorothy's groundbreaking career in print and television broke barriers for women in media, and her commitment to investigative reporting make a lasting impact on American journalism. And I was so proud of the fact that I had something to do with this occurring. But this gave Dorothy the respect that she deserved, and I hope that is going to continue, where people who end up in New York City will walk by that intersection and look up and see this sign right over here, okay, that they sent me, a replica, and say, who's that? And then they'll go into the internet and find out about this amazing woman.
All right, so that's a recap of all the research on Dorothy Kilgallen. Mm-hmm. Now we want to focus a little bit on the Mafia Don, Carlos Marcello, who Dorothy was focusing on as the source of the decisions. There probably were other people in the Mafia that were involved in it as well, but this guy had a particularly harsh reason to do what he did. So let's look back a little bit.
Well, Carson,
he doesn't look anything like a Mafia Don, so.
Oh, no. Not at all.
So we're moving back in time now. This is a picture
right.
from 1951 or 59.
Something like that, yeah. So, again, motive, okay? That's my pal. And I always, you may think this is crazy, I've always felt that Dorothy kind of led me to some of the evidence. And this is the first name that popped up. Why? Because the Kennedys knew that they were going to lose the 1960 election to Richard Nixon. So what did they do? Joe Kennedy had some buddies in the Mafia, including him, Sam Giancana, Trafficante, so on and so forth, because Joe was a bootlegger. So they got a hold of a couple of them and said, listen, you help us win the election in Illinois and West Virginia and get JFK in the White House, and if you do, we will leave you alone. All right? Instead, Robert F. Kennedy, who wrote this book about the Mafia, decided when he became Attorney General with no experience, he was going to go after somebody. And you can only imagine how upset these mafioso were. If I had more time, I'd tell you a personal experience with regard to them, because you can't mess around with those guys. And here's what he wrote in the book. They are sleek, often bilious and fat, or lean and cold and hard. They have smooth faces and cruel eyes of gangsters. They wear the same rich clothes, the diamond ring, the jeweled watch, and the strong, sickly, sweet-smelling perfume. So what did he do? First thing, he knew about Marcello, and they had appeared at these hearings and everything, all right? And that JFK and RFK had, and they took the Fifth Amendment and so on and so forth, and he was dedicated to cleaning up the mob, which is a good intention, right? But what he did then is he illegally deported that man to Central America, tricked him into going to an immigration office, there you go, in April 1961, and sent him to the wilds of Central America where he almost died. So he comes back into the United States. And you can imagine the situation, okay? The author of Wise Guy book, and who's given me endorsements for some of my book, told me one time the middle name for Sicilians is revenge. So when he got back in the United States, he wanted to kill the SOB Robert Kennedy. But he's a smart enough guy, he doesn't want to risk his $1 million empire with all the illicit things that he was doing, illegal thing he was doing. So what he says to himself, if I kill Robert Kennedy, JFK will come after me with everything the government has. But if I eliminate JFK, Bobby will be powerless. And that is exactly what happened in 1963-64. Okay? Now you're going to learn later that he had to wait 5 years till 1968 when it looked like Robert Kennedy was going to become president of the United States to act again and use a patsy and eliminate Robert Kennedy because he could never let him become president because Marcello knew that Bobby knew that it was Marcello who killed his brother. So all of this is pretty logical and common sense, and that's what I pride myself in doing when I'm talking to the readers, like I talked to juries before. So where do we go from there? Well,
all right. So we go to November 22nd, 1963. This is right before the assassination. Mm-hmm. And why don't we play the next video?
Please.
I'd like some legal representation. These police officers have not allowed me to have any. I don't know what this is all about.
Kill the president?
No, sir, I didn't. People keep asking me that. Sir?
You shoot the president?
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man. Did you shoot the president?
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
President?
And he's the perfect guy to be a patsy. Just like Ron Pataki is going to be with Dorothy Kilgallen's death because they can compromise him. Nobody has ever come up with a logical motive as to why Oswald shot the president. There isn't any. It's fabricated throughout the years, this Oswald alone thing. And I will tell you that later on we're going to talk about a cover-up of some of the evidence that I've uncovered and others, because there's a modern-day J. Edgar Hoover who's part of that, and that's exactly what Hoover did back then. He did not want anybody to believe there was, I hate to use the word because I don't use it in my books, that there were any conspiracies or whatever. Because he cannot go ahead and let that happen because he knows Marcello is responsible for JFK's death. So what happens to this poor guy, okay? As Melvin Belli told Dorothy, Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. Now just think about it logically again. If you're a mafioso and you've gone ahead and set up JFK for the kill, and then they capture Oswald, you've got a loose end, don't you? So you've got to get rid of Oswald. And that was Jack Ruby. And that's what Dorothy Kilgallen found out when she talked to him at the trial. That's why she thought she could crack the case wide open. So this is, in fact, one of my supporters that just looked at a presentation sent me some information recently about where Ruby got his gun. That the night before Oswald was killed, Ruby was having dinner at a restaurant in Dallas with one of Marcello's thugs, and all of that. So I've been able to piece together all of that connection between Marcello, Oswald, Ruby, and so on and so forth. And now we're going to get to 1968, 5 years later.
I have one question for the audience before we go there. All right? The question is, given the age of our audience here and everything, how many people watched this shooting on television when they were children or teenagers? Yeah. I mean, a lot of people saw this on live television. And I know I live close enough to Chicago. The first thing I thought as a 10-year-old was, That's a mafia shoot because, you know, it's like first they get somebody to shoot him and then they shoot the guy who was like right out of central casting, all of it. So anyway, now we move forward, as Mark was saying, and now we're in a situation where Robert Kennedy suddenly has gotten in the race, and it now looks like he might become president, and Marcelo didn't like that, maybe.
Of course not. By then, 1968, he's got $1 billion empire, and I found that in FBI records. He cannot, plus he knows the first thing, and I've been able to prove that through some accounts, that the first thing that Robert Kennedy says he's going to do is go after Marcelo. Well, he can't let that happen. So the challenge here then was, okay, Mark, you've got the first two deaths there, JFK and Dorothy, but how are you going to connect Carlos Marcelo with this Sirhan? And I started thinking about, all right, they're going to need to compromise him. They're going to need to come up with something that they could possibly do to go ahead and figure out exactly how they can use him as a patsy, as a fall guy. Okay? What do we got?
That's a picture right after the shooting.
That's right after the shooting. That's not Sirhan.
No. And this is Sirhan. Okay, and now we have a video to show you about some background on Sirhan.
John had found his roots in the racing circuit of Southern California, spending time at Hollywood Park, Fairplex, and Del Mar. But all the while, he called Santa Anita home. John's life at the track proved for the most part to be fairly uneventful. But that would all change in the summer of 1968.
My grandparents, my mom would stroll me out to the track at the paddock area. A hot walker would come by and greet my family, greet me, and that man's name was Sirhan Sirhan.
This young man comes right by and he says, I'm looking for work, do you need anybody? So I looked at me, the guy not much taller than me. I said, the only job we have is a hot walker. A hot walker is a man or a person that walks the horses after they've exercised. They're washed off and they walk them around in the ring till they're cooled out. And I said, well, that's the only job I have, and it pays $200 a month. I said, if you're interested, I need a hot walker. He said, I'll take it. We call him Saul. Very quiet, and he was like subservient in a way. Not only would he walk the horses, he'd clean all our racing tack, he'd sweep out our little office, he'd sweep the shed row, he'd do all this work for nothing, because he liked to work. We were in the tack room one day. A friend of mine and we were sitting in the office there, and he was reading the Los Angeles Times. And on the front page, I think it was, he said, he shouted out loud, hey, Bobby Kennedy is arming Israel, or something like that, he said that. As soon as he said that Sirhan, he went into a rage. He roared and shouted and he screamed, and how wicked of a man he is. Man should be dead, he's killing my people, because he is Palestinian. My friend and I were looking at him with our mouths wide open, because he'd been from a mouse to a lion in a matter of seconds. And finally I said, so calm down. I said, what do you know about politics in it? He rattled every senator and congressman in the United States and what state they was from. He knew everything about politics. So he calmed down, eventually calmed down. We're over at Hollywood Park. I saw him going up the steps with these people, and I said, funny, I said to my wife later on that evening, I said, I saw Saul at the racetrack, all dressed up, he had money, and he didn't seem to be working. He had these couple of hoodlums with him. I can't remember who they were. I've seen these people before. I think they've been thrown off the track once. The day that Kennedy was shot, I was working at the racetrack, and they flashed his picture on the TV. They said, do you know this man? So my wife saw it, and she saw who it was. She called Hollywood Park, and they said, I'd like to talk to my husband. It's very, very important. So they got me to the phone, and she said, guess what? Bobby Kennedy's just been shot, and guess who shot him? Saul. You have to tell somebody. So I put the phone down in a hurry. I ran down to the security office, and I told myself, I know the man who shot Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy. And I told him who he was, said he worked for me. Our phone was tapped for a year. I said, you sure it's tapped? And my wife said, yes. Every time she picked it up, there was a click. And she said, I think my phone is tapped. And so she called the phone company, but they wouldn't deny it, and they wouldn't say yes or no. But I know it was tapped, because they thought I might have had some information or something.
So how did I find this videotape? You'll find the link in the book. You can read about that and everything. How did I find this? That videotape's been up on the internet for years. I am amazed at times of researchers. I'm not the greatest researcher that ever lived, for sure. And yet these people who have written all these books, and they say they're experts, and they've said they do their research, and they're still Oswald alone people today, and somehow or another, I'm the one who finds this video, and my wife, I think, was scared. I screamed. I just couldn't believe it, because here was this man, and I'll tell you how legitimate he is as far as an account goes. He was a real hero. When he was handling the hot walking and stuff in the pen there where the horses were, all at once one of the horses started galloping all over the place. There was a little 5-year-old girl over here. And he stood between the little girl and the galloping horse and saved her life. You'll see that in the video. And he broke almost every bone in his body, saving that little girl. You talk
We're talking about Jonathan Shear here, the older man.
This is John Shear.
John Shear.
This is John Shear.
It's not Sirhan that did that.
No, John Shear.
John Shear that did that, yeah.
Excuse me, John Shear.
Yeah.
And he saved that life. So I've been able then to take that information, which I found there, and then escalate it on into how am I going to connect Marcello into Sirhan. And one night, I get my best ideas, maybe you do too, in the middle of the night. Now, I used to use a legal pad or notes, nude cards, but my wife finally made me get a smartphone, so I use that notes on there now. But this is what I put on this legal pad one night. And what it shows is, if you'll look there, it shows the connections with Marcello to all of these different people. And that was what I did. You can see it's corruption. There's a dissent on the Warren Commission that he protected from happening. Jack Ruby, Lee Harvey Oswald, all of that. His thumbprint, his footprint is all over each one of these individual situations. And that's where we came up with the idea, George did, of there being a pattern between the killings of JFK, Dorothy Kilgallen, and Robert Kennedy. All right? So what I had to do next is, how am I going to connect Marcello with Sirhan? And the key to that was a mobster named Mickey Cohen. Mickey Cohen was a Los Angeles gangster. Guess who his attorney was? Melvin Belli. And Belli knew about the Marcello connection and everything else. So what does he do? He goes ahead, he handles the rackets, the gambling, the prostitution, everything on the West Coast, including control of the racetracks. Santa Anita Park, Hollywood Park, all of that. So I start looking into, wait a minute, could Marcello have used his friend and confidant, Mickey Cohen, to have set up Sirhan as the patsy? And I have a lot of evidence in the book, accumulation of evidence in the book that I think you'll be interested in. But what really triggered my belief that I've got it right is a comment that I found that Mickey Cohen wrote in his book. Annexing several suites at the exclusive Ambassador Hotel, I opened up a high-stakes money crap game for the handplate clientele. At the time, I was close to some people at the hotel and who had to do with the operation of the establishment. I contacted them, and I was able to know what was going on in the hotel. Where was Robert Kennedy assassinated? Ambassador Hotel. So I've got other evidence in there that connects all this together. But in my mind, there is no way, and we're going to talk about it now, in terms of whether Sirhan was accountable for Robert Kennedy's death. All right, here's the bombshell. While the first of the year, oh my God, the whole world was happy. The President of the United States said, we're going to release all of the JFK assassination records. All right? By the way, to this date, that's never happened. No,
shocking.
Yeah, shocking, yeah. Anyway, so they released a lot of them. and I poured through them as I had the ones before that, looking for Marcello, nothing in there. Looking for Dorothy Kilgallen, nothing in there. Sirhan, nothing in there. And while doing so, I came across some FBI files that had not been released. All right, they're all supposed to be released, remember. FBI files that were supposed to be released. And I was able then to find this information about what these files supposedly said and what was in there. And my wife was helpful in our looking at not the National Archives, but the Internet Archives. And so we were able to legitimize the fact that this is the most important document ever about the JFK assassination and the most important document that is being hid from the public right now. What does it say? You can read it yourself, but the crux of it is that what happened, and I've been able to go ahead and substantiate now the fact that Carlos Marcello was arrested and convicted of some bribing of some officials in New York, in New Orleans, and he was tried in a court there and found guilty of conspiracy and so on and so forth, and sentenced to prison. He ends up in a prison in Texarkana, Texas, and the FBI then goes ahead and they want to see if they can get evidence about his participation in the JFK assassination. So what do? In true fashion of the FBI, they put a snitch in there. And the man's name was Jack Ronald Van Lanningham. And he got to know Marcello, all right? And they decided, well, oh, wait a minute, we want to audio tape anything he talks to Marcello about. So they gave him a transistor radio with a recorder in it. And he then went ahead and was able to talk to Marcello, who said, I believe you can read it, right?
Yeah.
Marcello, yeah, I had the son of a bitch killed. I'm glad I did. I'm just sorry I couldn't do it myself. All the speculation over the years, all the craziness of some of these hell, it's just, I just hate this distortion of history. Now, is that being put out to the public? No, it's not. No, it's not. And a lot of my research is not being put out there either. Why? Because the president appointed a task force on uncovering secrets, government secrets, or something like that it's called, all right? And they put in charge a congresswoman from Florida named Anna Paulina Luna, who had absolutely no experience with doing something like this. In fact, her main claim to fame before she became a congressman was appearing on the cover of Sports Illustrated in a bathing suit. You talk about putting somebody in charge of a commission and then going ahead and believing that she's going to do her job. She started off by saying, let's see if I have that quote anyway. She started off by saying, okay, now we're going to get to the bottom of all this. We're going to get to the truth. We're going to uncover the secret documents that we need to, and so on and so on and so forth. Well, unfortunately, she got the ear of a guy named Jefferson Morley, who is a so-called expert researcher, who is an Oswald Alone fanatic and a CIA fanatic. And he has led her down the line of going ahead and refusing in any way to look at people appearing at the hearings, providing research. I sent several letters to Congresswoman Luna. Here's my research. I want to contribute to history by telling you what I know about the JFK assassination, the Marcello confession, and more than that, too, about this material about the Robert Kennedy assassination. A friend of mine, a supporter, I sent those letters to her, and then he got me about a 15-minute conversation with her, and I laid out everything I knew, and I said, I would appreciate your allowing me to appear at the next hearing. And she said, I'm receptive to that. Do you think I've ever heard from her? No, not at all. And so what they're trying to do, again, is to trick you, the American public, into, so this is just a repeat of history. If you think about it, it's a repeat of the Warren Commission. And it's really unfortunate because we need to know the truth. And it's so interesting, too, about a month after being in this office of running the commission, she said, now, I want to make it clear, by the way, honest to goodness, she said this, I want to make it clear that we are not going to point the finger at any one person who was involved in the JFK assassination. Waste of government time and money. And I'm going to do everything I can to go forward and try to bring out the truth here with regard to what happens. But for whatever reason, this is a complete cover-up of what really happened with regard to JFK and RFK. And I want now to get to, if we may, George, the whole situation with Robert F. Kennedy, Jr.
Well, here, one more slide here. This is the information from the library on that piece of information that we just got, that Mark had from the FBI.
Right.
And we'll just leave that up. Those are the links between Marcello and JFK and the Kilgallen murders. These are all the people that Marcello knew that were part of the whole process. And you kind of saw that on Mark's chart, but
here's what you
more
do.
detail.
Yeah, here's what you do if you don't want people to know about about the fresh research and the truth and everything else. You just leave it out of books. You just leave it out of the task force. There is not one book out there that includes my research and that of Dorothy Kilgallen's. Not one, only my books. Now you may say, well, maybe they just think you're crazy, Mark. Well, maybe they do. But include it in there and let people make up their own mind. That's what I try to do. That's what George does with these incredible programs that he provides here at the Commonwealth Club. He doesn't try to tell everybody what he thinks. He just presents the information and then they can make up their mind. So what happened then after I put all this together? Well, what about Robert Kennedy? Robert Kennedy and Robert Kennedy Jr. Because I had always been intrigued by the Robert Kennedy assassination. So what I decided to do is look at what did Robert Kennedy say after he was called by J. Edgar Hoover about JFK's assassination. That very day, in the book you will read, he told his friends, it's the guy from New Orleans, okay? And other similar things. He knew it was Marcello. And after a while, he backtracked from that, of course, and all of that. So all of that is in the book. And then I started looking at Robert Kennedy Jr., when he was still an environmentalist, when he was still, doing the things that I felt like and other people did that were worthy before he became part of the new administration. And you make up your own mind about that. But I looked at him, and he was saying, my dad knew it was the guy from New Orleans, all right? And then he would backtrack from that. And I watched a video of his performance on one of the Fox shows where he finally said, no, it was the CIA. It was Oswald. It was the CIA for sure. It wasn't Marcello. So that's where that came from. So what I decided to do was to try to get Sirhan. Sirhan is not accountable, and I want to make sure I give you exactly what, in the book you will read the 10 or 12 reasons why Sirhan is innocent. Here's what Robert Kennedy Jr. has said over the years. There are too many bullets. You can't fire 13 shots out of an 8-shot gun. I spent 3 hours visiting Sirhan in prison last year after researching my father's assassination for months. I got to a place where I could see Sirhan. I went there because I was curious and disturbed what I have seen about the evidence. I am a strong advocate for the release of Mr. Sirhan B. Sirhan since I learned evidence that was not presented in the court at trial. After years of careful investigation, I arrived at the conviction that my father's murder was not cut and dried. He visited Sirhan in prison in the company of Sirhan's lawyer. Bobby hugged Sirhan and told him he knew he hadn't killed his father, and they considered him as much as a victim as his father. Look, get this. Sirhan is a sweet man, Bobby told the author after his visit. He took the time to learn the truth about the case. When he found what he found moved him to action. And then finally, I am disturbed that the wrong person might have been convicted of killing my father. He was a chief law enforcement officer in this country. I think it would have disturbed him if somebody was put in jail for a crime they didn't commit. And in 2021, the strongest advocate for Sirhan being paroled was who? Robert Kennedy Jr. And they got the parole. And then the government of this state stuck his nose in there and decided Sirhan has never admitted what he did, and he's a threat to society. This man is 81 years old, has spent 60 years in prison. So what I decided to do, and I'm going to keep fighting for his justice for sure, is that just recently I wrote a 6-page letter to Robert Kennedy Jr. that was delivered today. And in that letter, I said to him, here's the whole situation. Here's your dad's comments. Here's your comments. I know that you want to do the right thing here. And I want you to spearhead the new investigation into Sirhan's death, or in the alternative, because this man is so up in age, I want you to go to the president and you tell him that he should pardon Sirhan, because that's the right thing that should be done now. Now, whether I will ever hear from Robert Kennedy Jr., I do not know, but I will keep after this as much as I can. There's a quote George knows that I have used for a long time. It's by a famous novelist. The dead cannot cry out for justice. It's the job of the living to do so for them. So JFK, Dorothy, and Robert Kennedy, and somebody on a radio show recently asked me, why do I keep fighting for these people? And I say, because they're clients of mine. They're clients of mine just like the ones that I had when I was a public defender and a criminal defense lawyer. So I'm going to keep fighting for this. I don't know whether or not I'm going to get any action on it or not. But Sirhan, for sure, deserves the justice, a new trial, whatever it may be. And I'm going to fight till the day I die to try to get that pardon or a new investigation of his death, and then the investigations of Dorothy and JFK.
One detail I want to add here that's in the book is Sirhan was there at the time of the shooting. He did have a gun. He did shoot. But the physical evidence of what actually killed Robert Kennedy indicates that it couldn't have been the shots from Sirhan. So Mark isn't saying Sirhan didn't, he was a patsy brought in by Marcello to shoot him, but he was also to take the fall, and somebody else actually was there to shoot him. I think that's your conclusion.
This shows how much smarter George is than me. Because there's new ballistic evidence that I found. Heck, if you look at the photograph, look at it. Sirhan is in front of Robert Kennedy. The shots go in the back and the neck of Robert Kennedy. Now, some people have said Robert Kennedy might have moved or whatever, but that just is their way of proving what they want to prove. So George is right. He was there. I've even thought about the possibility if I could get the LADA to somehow or another. I used to do this when I was a criminal defense lawyer. For Sirhan to plead guilty, for instance, to attempted murder or something, even though that's not true, okay? And then the court would sentence him to time served. But I want him. I've talked to the lawyer for Sirhan. I think that might be possible, but what I really want is to clear his name, because even though he was there and the shots that he fired and all of that, they've never been able to match the bullets in his gun with the ones in Bobby Kennedy. So George is exactly right, and I'm so glad he mentioned that.
The only reason I'm right is I read Mark's book.
Well, thank you. So you got three. Just one more thing. You by the way, in case you don't care about a lot of this, there are 3 true crime murder mysteries here that should have never been mysteries before, but I think it'll be interesting if you do decide to look at the book. Just see how the 3 true crime mysteries, murder mysteries, how they just the pattern goes through, as George has mentioned, through these deaths, and I think you will see a thread there that connects all 3 of the deaths, which is the first time anybody's done this, as I have in my book.
Now, I'll bet that you might have a couple questions for Mark. Does anybody have any questions?
Richard, I know you're out there, and you're an inquisitive man. You've got to ask me something.
Do we have a mic? Okay, great. Here comes the mic. Somebody have the question? Here comes the mic.
I heard a report once on radio many years ago at the Ambassador Hotel immediately after Robert Kennedy was shot. a man and woman left through a stairway, through a side stairway, and were never seen again.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the woman in the polka dot dress. And there are a lot of different scenarios that people have provided in terms of what happened there. One that I found that's in the new book I think you'll be interested in is, what did Ethel Kennedy do after RFK was killed? Well, she just almost went berserk because she was so upset with regard to what happened and all of that. But in this situation, it's all speculation about the woman with the polka dot dress. Another one is the security guard, guy named Caesar, who a lot of people have said was responsible for shooting him. It's a little bit like the whole situation with JFK in Dealey Plaza. No, but I've never really concerned myself too much with all of that because there's just so many different theories out there and so on and so forth. In the book, you're going to learn about another guy that was shot in Dealey Plaza that day that JFK died that nobody knows about. And it was the same thing with the crime scene was a mess. They were in and out with people. I just found an FBI file where the FBI, one of the FBI honchos said that they had to talk Clyde Tolson about the fact they hoped that that somebody would kill the Kennedys. And he also talks about then the fact that there were so many holes in the Sirhan case and so on and so forth that way. So Richard, yes, that could have happened. That could have happened. But there's so much speculation in that. I don't speculate. I really try to project direct evidence and then let the reader make up their mind. Yes, sir.
So there are audio recordings of LBJ. This is during the formation of the Warren Commission and Hoover and other individuals whom LBJ wanted to, strong arm onto the commission, presumably to get the preset definition that Oswald acted alone.
Right.
What, if this is true, would be LBJ's motive in being a part of the cover-up?
I'm only laughing because I want to know if George puts you in the audience as a plant. Because no, just a second. No, oh, there you go. There you go. People ask me if I'm scared about what I've written. I say I only write about dead people for the most part. But, very observant on your part, those recordings, audio tape recordings between LBJ and Hoover are in the book. And it shows, you should see the procedure they used to pick the members of the Warren Commission. Well, Jerry Ford's not smart enough. We got to bring him on. This guy is this guy. This guy. They picked a couple senators that Dorothy Kilgallen then found out from one of them, but they were bull-whacked into the Oswald alone theory and all of that. LBJ, if you talk about motive, but also benefit from the crime, Marcello benefited from the crime. But who benefited more than Marcello? LBJ. He became president of the United States. But I have never been able to, you can go through all these hoops with the CIA, the Russians, the Cubans, LBJ, all these different people, but you got to go around and everything else like that. You saw that drawing that I did. This is all direct evidence with regard to Marcello being involved. And I think that's the strongest evidence out there. People, when you read the book, you may disagree, and if you do, you get in touch with me. MarkShawBooks.com is my website. My email's up there. Please let me know that you think I'm way off kilter, or you agree, or you know something about the assassinations. That's what I'd appreciate.
It's time for one more question.
There was a book that came out about 10 years ago, written by a scholar back east, and it was George Mason University, one of the universities.
Yes, sir.
Referenced a person who was actually a good friend of mine that said he was involved in played a lead role in the assassination of RFK, and that was Bob Mayhew. I was wondering if you could make any comments on that book or any views you have on Bob Mayhew.
Boy, I'm not aware. That's the first time I've ever heard that name, but if you would stay after and give me the name of that book, I'll take a look at it. The best books about the JFK assassination and the Robert Kennedy assassination are in the past. I found a book by John H. Davis, who wrote Mafia, Kingfish, and some other material about the JFK assassination, and he corroborates my research with regard to Robert Kennedy's death, with JFK's death, and so on and so forth that way, and he is quoted in the book. Unfortunately, he's not living anymore. But some of the best work was done back then by Dorothy Kilgallen, by John H. Davis, and there's a couple more. In recent years, unfortunately, what's happened is that the author, James Patterson, just wrote a book. I'd like to strangle him. I put the first review up on Amazon I've ever done. He wrote a book about the last days of Marilyn Monroe, and that poor woman has been, her reputation tainted for years and years and years. She didn't commit suicide. Dorothy Kilgallen proved that, or went ahead and found out evidence to that effect. But Patterson wrote a book, The Last Days of Marilyn Monroe, a true crime thriller. I go 3, 4, 5 pages in the book, and here's what it says. This is a work of fiction. This is a work of fiction. The names of the people are patterned after whatever. I mean, that is just disgraceful. But that's what happens a lot of times where, you know, I think he's run out of ideas for his novels, so he decided to do this. But poor Marilyn, she can't defend herself. I'm going to try to defend her. But for the most part, you know, let that woman rest in peace, for God's sakes. That's my 2 cents.
One more question. You have another one?
Yes, thank you. Haven't read the book yet, and I will, but curious to see what that bridge or the connection of Oswald's involvement, lifelong involvement with the CIA, and where the connection with Marcello, it almost begs the question that there was some interaction with the CIA and Marcello and his group, particularly with Oswald himself, notwithstanding Sirhan. So that's my question.
Well, Jefferson Morley did all of this research for 2 years, connecting Oswald and the CIA to JFK's death, and then said, there's no direct evidence of that, because there isn't. The CIA followed poor Oswald, well, I shouldn't say that, but Oswald around the world, Russia, Mexico, Cuba, every place they possibly could. And yes, as it got closer to the assassination, they followed him even more, and they believed that they could connect him to JFK's death. But they couldn't. They couldn't do it. And so, unfortunately, these books that are involved that way. As far as Oswald and Marcello, I pride myself on finding sources that nobody else found. And I came up, you'll love this name, a guy named Frenchy, who was a mafioso, lower ledge mafioso in New Orleans. And there was a book written about him. And I tracked down the author, and I then substantiated what was in there. He was a very close friend of Carlos Marcello. He said that the assassination of JFK, the foundation for it was in Marcello's office. That the first thing he did when he began looking, knowing Marcello, was walk into Marcello's office and see Lee Harvey Oswald. So there's that kind of evidence from this man, who I believe is very credible. So I don't know. Maybe there was some involvement with the CIA with Marcello, but he didn't need them. He had his own. These mafioso don't need anything to go forward. I'm going to tell my quick story, okay? When I was with Good Morning America, covering trials and things like that, they sent me to Philadelphia to interview the lawyer for a mafia don there who controlled the city. His name escapes me right now. So I went to his law office, this lawyer, and I interviewed him, and I was amazed at what he told me about them getting into the gambling at Atlantic City and all of this, okay? And so I had that report. GMA, that was when David Hartman and Nancy and Sandy Hill were on air. You might remember that. And they played that, and it was hugely popular with the audience. So they called me at my hotel in Philadelphia, and they said, Mark, go back to that guy and see if he'll talk to you again. So I called the office. This is a true story. A woman answered. I could tell there was something wrong. I said, are you okay? I could tell she was crying, and she said, well, Mark, I guess you don't know. When my boss started his car this morning, it blew up. and I got the hell out of there. And when I started practicing law, I got a couple opportunities to represent mafioso, and I turned them down because you can't mess around with those. Okay, the man I mentioned is Nick Pileggi, who's a famous author, wrote Wise Guy, or Goodfellas, that became, the movie and everything. Revenge is the middle name of the Sicilians.
I want to say one last thing, although I have my own suspicions that this is not Mark's last book on the subject. But one last thing about the whole process and what you were just saying about it. And that is, you're not saying for sure that the CIA isn't involved and for sure that somebody else is involved and for sure. It's just saying this is the evidence that really lines up. That's very solid. We know this much is true. We don't, of course, know all the players. But there is the clear evidence that this one Don in New Orleans was probably involved in all 3 of those deaths. So that's
I'm a little more certain than George is.
Yeah.
But, what I will tell you is I've never had any of these experts out there contest my evidence and my conclusions. They don't even put that in the books. Vincent Bugliosi, who was the prosecutor of Charles Manson, he got in touch with me before he wrote the damn book, and I told him about Dorothy Kilgallen's research and all of that, and Vince said to me on the phone, because I knew him, I'm going to put it in the book. You think he did? Of course not. So I think I've come as close to logical, common sense evidence that Marcello orchestrated these 3 deaths using the patsy as a pattern, as George was wise enough to know when he first read the book. Thank you.
And so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club World Affairs in its 123rd year of enlightened discussion.
Wow.
In many of those years, Mark has contributed.
Glad to do so.
Thank you very much for coming and joining us.